It started on a quiet Wednesday morning when Mark Henderson walked out onto the porch of the house he had worked 20 years to buy, only to find a fluorescent orange violation notice slapped across his front window like a scarlet letter. Improper. Placement of trash bins, it read, in bold letters that screamed authority but dripped with pettiness. Mark stared at it, confused, as the bins were not only placed within the fence line, but were even behind a small privacy screen. He had lived in the neighborhood for less than 2 months and already had his third violation, each one signed by the same name in hasty cursive at the bottom, Karen Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. If you've ever had to fight for your right to breathe freely in your own home, this story is for you. What unfolded next turned one man's fight for peace into a battle against control, pride, and unchecked power. Stick around till the end, because the day Mark stood up to the HOA wasn't just about him. It sent shockwaves through the whole neighborhood and exposed a web of corruption hidden under layers of manicured lawns and petty bylaws. From the beginning, Mark had chosen this neighborhood for its quiet, tree-lined streets, proximity to the lake, and what the real estate agent called a tight-knit, safe community. What the agent failed to mention was that the tightness was enforced not through neighborly love, but through Karen's iron grip on the HOA board. She seemed to appear at every doorstep, every community meeting, and even drove the neighborhood. In her blue golf cart like some queen on patrol, everyone knew Karen. More importantly, everyone feared Karen, or at least they feared what Karen could do. Late dues? Your lawn's an inch too tall? That wreath is the wrong color? Good luck getting your next exterior request approved, was the whispered warning among neighbors, who smiled politely when she passed, but closed their doors and rolled their eyes afterward. Mark was not a troublemaker. He was a systems engineer, a former Air Force officer, and a man who believed in rules but also in fairness. His wife had passed 2 years prior, and after raising their son alone and finally saving enough, he had bought this house to settle into a simpler, more peaceful life. But peace was not what he got. The first violation had come for non-uniform mailbox paint, which baffled him as the mailbox was new and purchased from the same supplier the HOA recommended. The second was for leaving tools in plain sight, referring to a folded ladder visible behind a shed for barely 2 hours during a home repair. But this third violation pushed Mark to his edge. He walked to the HOA office that morning, a modest suite in the clubhouse, and asked to speak to Karen. The receptionist, a teenager chewing gum and barely looking up from her phone, said Karen was in a meeting and he could submit a written complaint. Mark insisted. 5 minutes later, Karen appeared. Her signature navy blue blouse and khakis crisp and pressed, and her face locked in a permanent state of performative concern. Mark, we have policies. You agreed to them when you moved in, she said already, turning her back toward her office. Karen, I followed the rules. I checked the guidelines, he said calmly. She spun around. Guidelines are interpreted by the board. That's me. You're welcome to appeal, she said, her smile brittle and dripping with false civility. Mark stared at her, realizing then that this wasn't just a matter of misunderstanding or bureaucracy. This was control, her control, and no one challenged her because doing so meant months of delays, fines, denial of permits, and sometimes even public shaming in the neighborhood newsletter. Over the next week, Mark began digging not just into his own violations, but into the HOS records. He discovered that Karen had been president for 7 years, re-elected by default each year because no one dared to run against her. The same board members, 2 of whom were her personal friends, approved every policy change, and the HOA's financials. Vague, loosely documented, filled with charges like community appearance enhancement and board administrative travel, without receipts or breakdowns. That's when he realized something deeper was at play. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was manipulating them for power. He started talking to neighbors. Some were hesitant, afraid even. Others, like the Delgados on Maple Court, admitted they'd been fined $500 for putting up solar lights in their yard. Lights Karen later approved for her own property. There were stories of withheld landscaping approvals, threats of liens, and even attempts to evict a retired couple over minor infractions. But as Mark listened, he also noticed something else: resentment, frustration, and readiness. People were tired, they just didn't know where to start. So Mark decided to lead. He called a private meeting in his backyard on a Sunday evening. He invited 10 neighbors, and to his surprise, over 30 showed up. People brought printouts, letters, photos, and even voicemail recordings. One man shared how Karen had confronted his teenage daughter at the community pool for inappropriate swimwear, a standard one-piece suit. Another neighbor, Susan, had been forced to remove her late husband's memorial bench because it wasn't on approved common space. As they talked, Mark realized the entire neighborhood had been living in fear under Karen's rule, and they were ready for change. But Karen wasn't going to hand over her control without a fight. 2 days later, Mark received a certified letter stating that his home was now under formal compliance review, citing multiple unverified infractions. Then came the anonymous complaint about noise from his illegal gathering. His application to repaint his deck a neutral gray was denied for being non-harmonious. Karen was hitting back fast and hard, but Mark wasn't afraid. He filed for a board election challenge under the HOA's own bylaws. He compiled a detailed, documented dossier of Karen's abuses, and he called the local county commissioner's office to inquire about HOA overreach and violations of homeowner rights. The commissioner's assistant mentioned something interesting. There had been multiple quiet complaints about Willow Creek's HOA over the years, but no one ever followed through. Most people give up, she said. But if you have evidence, we can help. That night, Mark set up a private website for the residents of Willow Creek. He uploaded scanned documents, complaint templates, and a step-by-step guide for requesting a special vote to amend the bylaws and initiate a leadership. Recall, in 3 days, it got over 100 signatures, more than half the neighborhood. And then came the moment of truth, the emergency HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Karen arrived last, flanked by her board allies, looking smug. But the air in the room was different. It buzzed with energy, with courage, with rebellion. Mark stood up front, armed with binders, printouts, and neighbors who were ready to speak. And just as Karen tried to call the meeting to order, he dropped a printed statement of petition signatures on the table. "We're done being ruled," he said. "This ends tonight." If you've ever wondered what one person can do when facing the machinery of petty power and fear, this is the story for you. Because what happened in the next 2 hours didn't just shake the foundation of one HOA, became a turning point. For an entire community, keep watching Sham Stories to see how this showdown exploded into a full-blown revolution and exposed the truth behind the woman who thought she owned the neighborhood. The moment Mark placed that thick binder of signatures and evidence on the HOA clubhouse table, the room went silent. Karen's face twitched in disbelief as she scanned the documents and saw the number of residents who had signed the petition to initiate a special recall election. The binders were not just filled with signatures, but with dated violations, photos, emails, and even screenshots from the HOA's internal portal that showed the pattern of biased approvals and enforcement. Mark didn't need to raise his voice. Truth carried its own weight. Stood there calmly as neighbor after neighbor took the floor. Susan with her memorial bench photos, the Delgados with receipts of fines, Mr. Simmons, who was nearly forced to sell his house due to escalating late fees, all presented like exhibits in a courtroom. And just like a courtroom, the room was filled with spectators who had remained silent for too long, finally finding their voice. Karen, always composed and smug in previous meetings, fumbled through her response. She claimed these were isolated incidents, that her only intention had been to preserve the neighborhood's integrity, and that the real threat was those who disregard structure and authority. But her words fell flat, her usual charm. Ineffective in the face of the overwhelming tide of proof and community support now staring her down, one by one, her board allies began to withdraw. Councilman Hughes, who had always nodded along with her rulings, suddenly looked at his shoes. Marlene, the treasurer, quietly exited the room during a heated testimony. And when someone from the back shouted, You fined me for wind chimes while approving your own tiki torches." The laughter that followed broke any remaining illusion of her control. It was clear the power dynamic had shifted. Mark wasn't trying to become the new HOA tyrant. He was simply asking for fairness, transparency, and freedom. The vote for a leadership recall was scheduled for the following week, and until then, tensions grew like a storm cloud over Willow Creek. Karen didn't take it lying down. Within 2 days, Mark received yet another violation letter, this time for public disruption. An absurd term created on the fly. Then came a letter from a law firm representing the HOA, threatening legal action for slander and inciting rebellion. Mark, who had seen far worse in his military career and worked with legal departments in his engineering role, calmly forwarded everything to his lawyer friend, who drafted a brilliant counter letter citing homeowner protection, statutes, and misuse of HOA funds. Karen, however, took the battle to the next level. She began sending out newsletters to residents filled with vague fear-mongering. "Don't let chaos take over our beautiful community," she wrote. "A neighborhood without order is a neighborhood without value." She painted Mark as a disruptor, a man who sought to dismantle the peace they'd all enjoyed. Ironically, that very peace had long been suffocating many. Karen even tried to hold an emergency amendment vote to give herself veto power over recalls. But the legal consultant who had now volunteered to help Mark's group quickly filed an injunction citing procedural violations. The vote was halted. Now, all eyes were on the upcoming special election. The night before the vote, Mark received an anonymous envelope on his porch. Inside were photos of him at the clubhouse meeting, at the grocery store, and even through the window of his home, blurry but unmistakable. It was a threat, a scare tactic. He held the envelope up to the porch light, his hand steady. This wasn't just about trash bins or tiki torches anymore. It was about dignity, the right to live freely, and the importance of standing up when no one else dares to. When voting day arrived, residents gathered at the community hall. The turnout was massive, far larger than any HOA meeting in Willow Creek's history. Even residents who hadn't spoken to neighbors in years came out of their homes, quietly whispering support for Mark. The ballot was simple. Should the current HOA board be dissolved and re-elected by full resident vote? Yes or no? As ballots were cast, the tension was thick. Karen stood near the front, trying to appear unbothered, wearing her signature navy blazer, but her fingers trembled as she held her clipboard. Mark, dressed plainly in jeans and a gray pullover, stood in the back, greeting people, answering questions, and letting the community speak for itself. When the votes were counted, the results weren't close. 132 yes, 218 no. The board was officially dissolved, effective immediately. Karen sat motionless, then stood and began gathering her things without a word. The residents didn't cheer. Were too stunned, too relieved, too emotionally drained. What had taken years to build and control had crumbled in minutes once truth had a microphone. In the days that followed, Mark and a few volunteers stepped in as interim board organizers. Their first move was to hire an independent auditor to comb through the HOA's financial records. What they found was shocking thousands in undocumented travel expenses, payments to vendors owned by Karen's relatives, and even bank transfers between HOA accounts and a personal LLC tied to her name. Legal action followed swiftly. Karen was subpoenaed and later faced charges for misappropriation of community funds. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly Willow Creek became the symbol of fighting back against tyrannical HOAs. Mark was invited to speak on local radio. News outlets called the story the revolt on Maple Lane. But through it all, Mark remained grounded. He didn't want fame. He wanted peace. Over the next few months, the neighborhood transformed it. Just physically, but emotionally. People started waving at each other again. Barbecues returned to cul-de-sacs. The community pool reopened with fair guidelines. Lawn decorations were still tasteful, but personalized. People began feeling like homeowners again, not tenants in their own property. Mark established a neighborhood council volunteer-based, transparent and rotating leadership every year. They installed a new digital portal where all financials were visible to every resident. Violations were now mediated through respectful conversation first, then process if needed. The HOA didn't disappear, evolved. As for Karen, she moved out 6 months later, her reputation in tatters. Her house sold below market value after disclosures were made. But she never apologized. Some say they still see her in a different neighborhood, clipboard in hand. Mark never pursued vengeance. He believed justice had its way of correcting the course. One quiet evening, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, the new neighborhood president, a woman named Alicia, dropped by. "Thank you," she said, not with fanfare, but with the genuine gratitude of someone who saw the difference one person could make. "You didn't just save your own peace, you saved ours." Mark smiled, nodded, and said only one thing. "We all deserve to feel safe in our own home." No. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't feel like tension. As Willow Creek settled into its new era of fairness and transparency, the sense of relief that swept across the community was palpable. Mark Henderson, once just another quiet homeowner seeking a peaceful retirement, had become the symbol of quiet resistance and the neighborhood's accidental hero. With the HOA's corrupt leadership dismantled, the audit concluded, and Karen gone from both the board and the neighborhood, most residents hoped things would return to normal. But Mark knew better. Systems don't change overnight just because one person is removed. The habits Karen had instilled, the fear of being watched, the suspicion among neighbors. The self-censorship still lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. And although the board had been restructured with rotating volunteers and full transparency, the scars of HOA tyranny were slow to heal. People were still hesitant to plant flowers that weren't approved colors, unsure whether it was truly safe to personalize their homes without reprisal. Recognizing this, Mark proposed a neighborhood restoration event not just for landscaping, but to rebuild trust. It was simple in concept, but revolutionary in its spirit. Every household would host a freedom expression project over one weekend. Some painted their mailboxes in bold colors. Others installed quirky yard art. Kids chalked the sidewalks with cartoons and positive quotes. One family even set up a giant inflatable movie screen on their lawn and invited the entire block to watch classic comedies under the stars. Mark didn't want to call it a rebellion or a celebration of victory. He called it our block, our voice. What he hadn't expected was how many people would show up, not just neighbors, but even residents from nearby subdivisions who'd heard the story. There were elderly couples who cried as they shared stories of silent fear under Karen's reign. There were parents who said their kids were once reprimanded for riding scooters too loudly. That weekend, fences became conversation starters instead of dividers. Strangers became allies. Mark had unintentionally sparked a neighborhood revolution, and its waves were reaching further than he imagined. But with visibility came a tension both positive and threatening. A few weeks after the community event, Mark began receiving emails from people in other HOAs across the state, asking for guidance, advice, or simply hope. Some were desperate homeowners who had been fined into foreclosure. Others were HOA board members trying to reform their rules from within, but facing organized resistance. Mark took time to respond to every message. He created a blog where he documented his journey, uploaded digital templates for petitions and complaint letters, and shared key parts of the financial audit for educational purposes. It was never monetized. He refused offers from legal consultants and home rights advocates to go big or turn it into a business. For Mark, it wasn't about building a platform. It was about helping people take back what was already theirs there. Homes, their voice, and their freedom. But not everyone liked that. About 2 months into his outreach work, strange things started happening again. His mailbox was bashed in twice in 1 week. He received an anonymous voicemail saying, "You're not the hero you think you are. Back off." Then one morning, he found a nail deliberately placed under his car tire. Told no one at first, brushing it off as coincidence. But when his blog server was hit with a DDoS attack and emails began arriving from fake accounts, accusing him of defamation, he knew someone was trying to silence him. At first, he suspected it was Karen trying to claw her way back into relevance from afar. But after a conversation with a tech-savvy teenager in the neighborhood who helped him trace the email headers, it turned out that digital harassment was coming from a corporate account, one belonging to a property management firm that oversaw multiple HOAs in the region, including Willow Creek, before Karen took over the board's full control. The firm had contracted with HOA boards to maintain order, enforce rules, and collect fees, often taking a percentage of fines and liens as commission. They had lost money when Karen's regime collapsed. Mark realized something critical. The problem had always been bigger than Karen. She was just the local face of a systemic issue. He began compiling information on other neighborhoods affected by similar intimidation. One homeowner in a neighboring county shared how their HOA had sued a widow for repainting her fence, using a corporate firm's legal team to bankrupt her into compliance. Another man said he was charged a daily fine for parking his RV on his own driveway while preparing for a cross-country move. And many of these boards had deep ties with the same few firms. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was a business one that preyed on homeowners through fear, weaponized fines, and legal threats. Mark couldn't look away. Started working late into the night, cross-referencing public records, compiling names, collecting victim stories. He knew he wasn't a lawyer, but he also knew the power of documentation. His once small blog had become a hub. A former city councilwoman from a nearby town reached out and suggested he testify at a local hearing on HOA reform. With humility and clarity, Mark agreed. At the hearing, Mark shared his experience, soft-spoken, but with undeniable truth. He brought copies of audits, redacted witness statements, and financial graphs showing the stark difference in community spending before and after HOA restructuring. Lawmakers listened. Few brushed it off as isolated or overblown, but others were clearly moved. The hearing led to the creation of a task force to explore regulation around HOA fines, transparency requirements, and external firm accountability. Mark was asked to join it as a citizen representative. But back in Willow Creek, his growing involvement stirred unrest again. Some of the newer residents, drawn in by the national attention, started forming their own little groups, worried that Mark's activism was attracting unwanted press and might affect property values. A whisper campaign began polite conversations, questioning his real motives. One flyer, anonymously posted in mailboxes, asked, "Is Mark building a movement or building a throne?" That stung more than any threat he'd received. He never wanted power. He just wanted freedom. But freedom, he realized, often comes with suspicion, especially when you challenge those used to controlling others through rules and red tape. Mark could have walked away. He thought about it. One night, standing alone at the edge of the lake, he considered deleting the blog, shutting down the outreach, and going back to quiet mornings on his porch. But then a young couple, new to the neighborhood, walked up to him and said, "You're the reason we moved here. We read everything. We finally felt like we'd be heard." That reminded him why he started all this. Not for fame, not for revenge, but because no one else had stood up until he did. And once he did, others followed. In the months that followed, the neighborhood stabilized. The HOA worked more like a cooperative than a governing board. Rules still existed, but were debated and voted on openly. Committees formed around real needs: safety, beautification, kids programs, not surveillance or punishment, although some still rolled their eyes at Mark's growing influence beyond. Willow Creek most respected the man who had risked his peace to restore theirs. At the next community barbecue, Mark stayed behind after everyone left, helping stack chairs. A woman named Doreen approached him. She had lived 3 houses down for years, but rarely spoke. She said gently, "We used to call you the guy who picked the wrong fight. Now we say, he's the one who taught us how to fight back." Mark smiled. Not because he sought praise, but because the community had found its voice. And voices, once freed, rarely go quiet. Again, by the time summer rolled around again, Willow Creek had become something of a quiet legend among neighboring communities. Its story of HOA rebellion now circulating far beyond county lines. Mark hadn't intended to lead a movement, but his insistence on standing firm, documenting every abuse, and involving the wider public had forced a reckoning. HOA Karen. once the neighborhood's self-appointed monarch, was now just a cautionary tale in reform discussions. But reform didn't mean the end of conflict. It simply meant the beginning of accountability. And for Mark, that accountability was becoming increasingly important, especially now that he was working with the state's Residential Rights Committee. He was invited to testify in front of the state legislature, where he presented everything from HOA overreach statistics to first-hand testimonies of abuse across different zip codes. It was emotional and draining work, especially considering how personal it had become, but it mattered. He remembered how helpless he once felt when Karen sent him that first violation notice, how small he'd felt being lectured over a mailbox, while the neighborhood watched silently. He used those memories as fuel to prevent the same thing from happening to others. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, the community was thriving. The kids played freely without being scolded for stepping on the grass. Seniors sat on porches without fearing citations for unsightly chairs. Fines were issued only in extreme cases, and always after mediation failed. It was far from perfect, but it felt human. Still, peace always has a price, and Mark would soon find out that not everyone had let go of the past. One morning, a city code enforcement officer showed up at his door unannounced. The man, polite but clearly uncomfortable, informed Mark that a series of anonymous complaints had been filed against his property claims, ranging from unauthorized storage to illegal modifications and environmental disruption. Mark raised an eyebrow. He knew his property was clean. Every change he'd made was well within city codes and even approved during public HOA meetings. But the officer insisted he had to follow up due to volume and pressure from higher offices. Mark welcomed him in, walked him through the yard, and even provided paperwork for the most recent shed remodel. The officer took photos, apologized, and left, admitting that it looked like someone was trying to make trouble. Mark didn't even have to ask. He knew who was behind it. Karen had vanished after losing her position and selling her home, but she had friends, including a cousin who worked in a nearby development firm with ties to property enforcement. It was subtle, like a whisper of the past, trying to claw its way back. But Mark didn't panic. Instead, he filed a public records request and confirmed what he suspected. All the complaints came from a single IP address, linked to a real estate property services office 3 towns over, owned by Karen's brother. He forwarded everything to the city, filed an official complaint about misuse of government services, and notified the Residential Rights Committee. But he didn't stop there. He also wrote a blog post titled "The Whisper War," when HOA tyrants won't let go, and detailed everything. The post went viral. Homeowners across the country wrote in, saying they too had been targeted post-conflict. Long after moving away from abusive HOAs, his story sparked a movement for whistleblower protection in HOA disputes, an area the law had previously ignored. But the deeper Mark went into the system, the more disturbing things he discovered. It wasn't just Karen. Many HOA boards, particularly in wealthier suburbs, were contracting with private security firms that posed as law enforcement, complete with uniforms, badges, and marked vehicles. These firms patrolled neighborhoods, issued fake warnings, and in some cases even detained residents under community preservation codes. Mark dug up video footage of one elderly man being escorted from a neighborhood park because he didn't look like he belonged, despite having lived there for over 20 years. The man had darker skin. The footage was horrifying. Mark compiled these incidents into a video documentary, narrated it himself, and released it online. It reached over 1 million views within a week. National media picked it up, and soon lawmakers began referencing Mark's materials during press conferences. But this visibility brought more threats. His email inbox filled with hate mail, legal cease and desist letters from security firms, and even fake subpoenas. One day, someone painted "snitch" across his driveway in red. His neighbors rallied around him, offering security cameras and even standing watch at night. The community he had once fought to protect was now protecting him. One night, during a town hall meeting, Mark addressed them all. "I didn't plan any of this. I just didn't want to be controlled. Didn't want my home, your homes, our lives regulated by people who thrive on fear." but I'm not backing down, because silence is where they win." The room erupted in applause, not because Mark was grandstanding, but because he was saying what everyone else was afraid to. That courage became contagious. A nearby HOA passed a homeowner rights bill within their charter, largely modeled on Mark's guidelines. Soon, HOAs across the state were rewriting their bylaws. A grassroots organization emerged. HOA, Free Voice, and Mark was asked to serve as its founding board chair. He declined, preferring to remain a civilian advocate, but he helped them draft a national framework for ethical neighborhood governance. Through all this, Mark never let go of his original goal: peace in his own backyard. He still woke up early, walked around the lake, waved at neighbors, and tinkered with birdhouses. His own property had become a symbol of balance, structured but personal, organized but not oppressive. Yet part of him knew the fight wasn't over. For every Karen who was exposed, there were 10 more using bylaws as weapons. But he also knew something else: freedom wasn't given. It was reclaimed. And now, more people than ever were waking up. One afternoon, a young man in his 20s knocked on Mark's door. He introduced himself as Jesse, a homeowner from a town 30 miles away. "I used your blog to challenge my HOA," he said. "They were fining us for feeding stray cats. We fought back, and now they're being audited." Mark smiled, invited him in, and poured coffee. They sat for hours. And Jesse wasn't the last. People came from all over, asking questions, sharing horror stories, offering solidarity. Mark's home had become a quiet hub for a national conversation. He didn't have the answers for everyone. He didn't want to lead a movement. He just knew how to tell the truth, and that was often enough. But behind that modesty, something else had grown: a legacy. It's not just in-laws changed or articles written, but in the thousands of ordinary people who now believed they had the right to question, resist, and demand better. And all of it started because one man refused to pay a fine for a mailbox that didn't match the approved tones. Sometimes, Mark thought, revolutions don't start with marches. They start with small, stubborn acts of defiance against the petty tyrants of the world. Sometimes those acts become the stories that change everything. Years had passed since Mark Henderson first pushed back against HOA Karen, and what began as a neighborhood confrontation over a mailbox had transformed into a nationwide conversation about homeowner rights, personal freedom, and the abuse of power by unelected neighborhood boards. The change was no longer local, it was systemic. Reform bills inspired by his testimony were now in committee at both the state and federal levels, targeting the unchecked authority HOAs had to levy fines, seize homes, and act without transparency. Media outlets occasionally reached out for interviews. Nonprofits often quoted him, and even university law students cited his experience in academic papers. But through it all, Mark remained the same humble man who just wanted to enjoy a quiet life in his home by the lake, tending to his garden, helping his neighbors, and waking up to peace, not panic. Despite the victories, he never lost sight of what it cost him: privacy, peace, and sometimes safety. The threats, though less frequent, never fully stopped. He'd become too recognizable. Strangers sometimes showed up at his house asking for help, occasionally desperate, sometimes unhinged. But Mark always treated them with kindness, remembering how it felt when no one listened to him. Willow Creek was still the shining example of what a neighborhood could become once freed from tyranny. The HOA board now held annual elections, had term limits, published transparent budgets, and most importantly, operated more like a neighborhood committee than a power structure. Residents had a say, disagreements were handled with decency, and community events had returned. One such event was the Willow Creek Freedom Festival, held every June. An idea that came from one of the youngest homeowners on the block, a girl named Carly, who remembered the fear in her parents' eyes during Karen's reign. The festival celebrated not just the defeat of a corrupt HOA, but the power of community when people stood together. Mark had resisted being the face of it, but the neighborhood insisted. That year, they unveiled a mural on the side of the community center, a collage of homes, families, flowers, and birds flying freely. In the center was a painting of a man standing on his porch, holding a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. It wasn't labeled as Mark, but everyone knew it was. It was their way of saying thank you. During the event, as laughter echoed across the park and kids painted colorful rocks to line the walking path, Mark stood quietly near the edge, soaking in the joy he once thought would never return. A man from a neighboring district approached him. He was a former HOA president, now a whistleblower. "I used to be like Karen," he admitted. Power went to my head. "Your story changed how I think. Now I'm helping undo the mess I helped create." Mark looked him in the eyes, shook his hand, and said, "We've all got something to unlearn. Glad you made it here." But just when life seemed to find its rhythm, a new challenge arrived. The city announced plans to rezone areas near Willow Creek for commercial development, including a potential bypass highway that would run through the southern edge of the neighborhood. That edge included the very lake Mark had fought to preserve from Karen's overreach. Once again, the threat wasn't a person, it was a system. The city argued that the highway would ease congestion and bring economic growth. But residents knew it would destroy the natural beauty, increase noise, and potentially lead to property value fluctuations. Mark, though tired, knew he couldn't sit this one out. Not after everything they had built. He began organizing meetings. Again, digging through environmental impact reports, consulting with local wildlife experts, and rallying neighbors to submit public comment. He didn't want to fight forever, but he would always fight for what mattered. This wasn't just about property or peace. It was about legacy. The legacy of a community that learned how to rise. Petitions circulated, residents packed town hall meetings, and pressure mounted on city planners. Mark even reached out to a young city councilman who once wrote to him during law school, now elected and eager to prove his integrity. "You taught me to care," the councilman said. "Now let me help you protect this place." Of debate, protest, and press coverage, the city withdrew the plan, citing overwhelming community feedback and unresolved ecological concerns. Once again, Willow Creek had stood its ground, not with shouting or destruction, but with unity, facts, and unwavering conviction. And at the center of it stood Mark, not because he asked to lead, but because he never gave up. That night, after the news broke that the highway plan was scrapped, neighbors flooded Mark's yard with candles, lawn chairs, and trays of food. They threw an impromptu celebration just as they had after Karen left. Mark sat quietly, overwhelmed not by noise, but by gratitude. At one point, Carly stood on a folding chair and raised a plastic cup. "To Mr. Henderson," she called out. "The man who reminded us that homes aren't just buildings there, where our voices begin." Everyone cheered, but Mark raised his hand gently. He said, "To all of you, because I didn't win anything we did together." In the weeks that followed, Mark finally allowed himself rest. He shut down his blog not because he was quitting, but because the work had been passed on. Others were continuing the movement now. New blogs, new forums, even a national alliance for HOA reform had formed, run by young activists and legal experts he once mentored. His name was known, but he didn't need it to be. What mattered was that the world had changed a little, and change, he realized, wasn't about revolution. It was about persistence. One morning, as he sipped coffee on his porch and watched a blue jay perch on the edge of the bird feeder, his neighbor Doreen joined him. She brought fresh muffins. They sat quietly for a long while. Then she asked, "So what's next for our neighborhood guardian?" Mark chuckled. "I'm just a man with a porch and a lot of birdseed. That's enough now." And it was. But deep down, he knew, if ever the rules became chains again, if ever voices were silenced by fear, and if ever another Karen rose to power, he'd rise again, not out of anger, but because peace must always be protected. The story of Willow Creek would live on. And in every corner of the country where someone pushed back against unjust rules, stood firm against fake authority, and chose freedom over fear, Mark's quiet